Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Coming up on today's show, we'll examine the Supreme Court's recent McCutcheon ruling and what it means for the future of democracy. Republicans, well, they're suffering from Bush amnesia, and they now think that having an imperial president is a bad idea for the country. That's something they didn't believe when Bush was in office. We'll bring you the details, and we'll take a look at the recent UN climate change report that says we're burning down the planet. And the consequences, well, they've already started, and they're getting much worse. We have all that and more coming up. But right now, just remember, you stepped into the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
Republicans are already lining up to kiss the rings of billionaires and millionaire campaign donors like Sheldon Adelson or the Koch brothers, where we don't have primaries anymore. We have billionaires deciding who the candidates are going to be. The party's become so beholden. This Republican teabagger party has become so beholden to the wealthy elite that they aren't even capable of pretending that they care about the democratic process of primaries. Joining me now to talk about that is attorney Stephen Berg. Stephen, it used to be that we had primaries that were taking place in the states, and you would have voters in the states vote for the candidate that they wanted. But now that we have this new system of oligarchy in the United States, we have billionaires that have candidates coming in, kissing their rings and deciding, which one of these do I want? Which one of these candidates will do the most for me? You have the Koch brothers, you have Sheldon Adelson doing this. It's just a new way of having primaries in the United States, isn't it?
Absolutely. Things have changed dramatically since Citizens United and the McCutcheon case. And since then, the billionaires are acting like kingmakers and deciding who's going to uphold their interests the most.
And so what we have this week, as a matter of fact, and last week, and actually it's going to go on for weeks on end, is you had Adelson actually summoning candidates, Chris Christie, Jeb Bush, Rick Scott, whoever it is that they thought might want to be their blessed new child running for president. They asked him to come to Las Vegas. I'll kiss my ring. Let me find out whether or not you will be the thug that I want you to running this country. And this is a guy that gave $93 million just in the last cycle, 2012 cycle, $93 million. And so they take him pretty serious, and they'll do whatever he asks them to do, won't he?
That's correct. And like you said, I mean, close to $100 million he gave in this last election, 2012. And the billionaires are really flexing their power here and getting candidates to line up with their special interests.
Well, what they're actually doing at this point is that you would think that, they're just fine to worry about Senate candidates and House of Representatives and the President of the United States. But what we're finding is they're pumping in money, big money, into things like school board races, into things like county commission races. County commission because you have issues that come up about issues like fracking, and they want to frack. They want to destroy our water systems. They want to extract as much as they can and make as much profit as they can at our expense. So they put money behind a county commissioner who will vote favorably for them on things like fracking or the pipeline, you name it. This is where they're putting money on local races, aren't they?
They are. In fact, the Koch brothers are running the campaign contributions to Americans for Prosperity. In particular, like you talked about, Wisconsin, they've actually gotten involved in a local county board election and have canvassed the whole area. So they really are trying to break into the local politics.
Yeah, I mean, we would worry about things like Citizens United and now the McCutcheon disaster, by this buffoon, Roberts and Scalia and Alito and all the regular court majority Republican buffoons that gave us Citizens United have now expanded that. And so now what we're going to see is that a vote by the average American really doesn't mean that much. I mean, the Supreme Court talks about free speech, but truthfully, the only speech that we're going to have in this country is the people who can buy the speech. And we're seeing it all the way down at the state level, aren't we?
That's absolutely true. I mean, what we're seeing too is they are buying it, and if you don't have the money to get on TV, you can't get your message out. And so it's exactly like Mr. Adelson did in 2012 with Newt Gingrich when he was losing the popular vote, but yet he was being funded by Adelson, and his campaign continued.
Yeah, funded to the tune of just actually millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars he put behind Newt Gingrich just to keep him in the race. And then all of a sudden, it's very clear that Newt Gingrich is a failure. You know, he's a terrible candidate. People recognize that he's a fraud. They recognize he's a terrible candidate. And so then Adelson shifts his money over to the next best possibility, which is Mitt Romney, and he puts tens of millions of dollars into Mitt Romney's race. So I don't know how this is democracy, Stephen. I don't know how we can look at this and call it democracy. What's your take on that?
You know what? It's a slow erosion of our democracy. The individuals, the constituents, no longer have a voice. The only people who have the voice are not millionaires; they're billionaires.
Yeah, it used to be that they would put together a gaggle of millionaires to pony up money, and they would do it by writing a bunch of small checks. Now the U.S. Supreme Court has said, don't worry about all that. We don't really have any limitations anymore. You don't have to write small checks. You can write $3.6 million for one election cycle if you want. How many people in this country can write a check for $3.6 million? And do you have a Supreme Court who clearly knows that? They know that this has now become a politics by the powerful and by the rich. Is there any question these people who decided U.S. Citizens United, who decided McCutcheon, they clearly know what the result of this is, don't they?
Absolutely, they know. I mean, they know right now that the price to win an election is going up and up and up by Citizens United, and of course that's going to benefit the billionaires, who they can throw their weight around and fund whoever is going to protect their interests.
Well, what they also know is that 94% of the time, the candidate with the most money wins. Now, let me ask you something. You're very familiar with this U.S. Supreme Court. You've had to follow them over the years. Is there any question in your mind when you read, for example, Citizens United, that this was actually part of the scheme of the billionaires? You have to have a Supreme Court that will ignore decency, that will ignore stare decisis, that will ignore precedent, and simply litigate and legislate by way of putting on a black robe. What you have is politicians that are dressed up in black robes in that majority, don't we?
Absolutely. The judiciary at the highest level has become very politicized and become corporate operatives that are now ignoring years and years and years of case law and campaign reform, and have undone that with these two cases.
And we have a judge. We had Roberts actually come out and say in the McCutcheon decision that, gee whiz, all of this money going into politics, it really will not have any effect on influence or affluence. He actually said that. He actually said there's no connection to corruption. We don't have to worry about it. The money will have zero impact on politics or democracy. I called him an idiot for that, but really he's really more than an idiot. He's actually a tool. He's a lapdog for corporate America, as are most of these other justices. Do you think I overstate that, other than the fact that he probably isn't truly a true idiot? You read his stuff and you think he's an idiot, but he's really working for corporate America, isn't he?
Absolutely. He's actually very smart in how he's working for corporate America, and has done a tremendous amount for the corporate special interests to erode our democracy.
Well, and as we go forward, the only thing that's going to change that is to change this majority on the court, and you have the Republicans putting all the money they can into this next presidency to make sure that right-wing, almost fascist majority never gets a chance to change. Stephen Berg, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Mike.
America recently witnessed another tragic mass shooting, and the right-wing response has been exactly predictable, as it always is. They think more guns are going to prevent tragedies. Joining me to tell us why this is a ridiculous claim is Elliot Fineman. He's the CEO of Gun Victims Action Council. Elliot, again and again, the same story told over and over. The facts are just mildly different every time. Another tragedy, another tragic shooting with the same kind of arguments coming from the NRA that we've heard time and time again. It's not our fault, it's everybody else's fault. What's your take on this last tragedy?
Well, as you say, it's something that's happened over and over and will continue to happen over and over because of the structural defect in how we go about allowing people to get guns. You may recall that this is very similar to what happened at the Navy facility in D.C., where the shooter there went to Virginia the day before to pick up the guns and then go and wreak havoc and kill people the next day.
Was the same store? I think it was the same store, as a matter of fact.
Yes, same store. And this is no. The one in Texas is the same store that the original Fort Hood shooter went to.
Okay.
So the same store. So here's the issue. We cannot be in a situation where somebody just walks into a store and can buy a gun even if they go through a background check, because the reality is that in the database that the FBI has, based on a grant I had received a couple of years ago, I did study the database intently, and I can tell you that except for a few states, 90% of the mental health records that should be in the system are missing. So that's number one. So that if 90% of the records are missing, in our background check, if you go in to buy a gun and you don't appear in the federal, in the NICS system, the background check system, you get that gun within either on the spot. If they have some questions and they're not sure, the FBI tries to do additional research. If they can't get an answer within 24 hours, in other words, they can't research further, you must get your gun. Okay, here's what should have happened, and here's what happens in England. If I go to buy a gun, number one, I have to have a recommendation from someone, a written recommendation saying I'm a stable person. They then interview people in my world. They'll interview friends, family, teachers, doctors, etc., to confirm that I'm indeed rational, in control, and qualified to get a gun. Now, here we have a situation where the killer was being diagnosed for PTSD, had complained about certain mental issues. They hadn't reached a conclusion yet, but so because they hadn't reached a conclusion, his name wasn't in the database system to, have stopped his purchasing the gun. But had we had a system like England, in other words, it's the fault it's a structural fault. They would have called around before giving him this gun, and they would have, of course, spoken to some of the doctors that were treating him, who would have said, explained that his mental condition was problematical, and he wouldn't have been able to get the gun. That's the issue. Look, we're not going to get to zero incidents. You can never, it's like with drunk driving. We don't, we cut it in half. We went from 20,000 deaths a year.
Yeah, now that is such a salient point here. You see, you have the gun industry saying you can't legislate improvement. But actually, the DUI issue is a great example of, yes, you can't make it go away, but you can darn sure legislate to improve it. The NRA's sale is, we can't do anything, therefore let's not try, isn't it?
Yes, that's exactly their position. If you can't get to zero, then do nothing. And it's an absurd position to have, but nonetheless, they advance it. We could have sound legislation that would have a real background check system, not what we have now, where 90% of the mental health records are missing. But even if they were in, here's a situation where someone for the moment, at least for the database system, would not be reported because they hadn't been adjudicated to be, a threat to themselves or others. On the other hand, if we had a system like they have in England, then by speaking to the people in the person's world, people like the Virginia Tech killer would not have been able to get their gun. People like the Arizona, the Gabby Gifford shooter, the Aurora shooter. Of course, the Newtown shooter wasn't able to get a gun because of age. But the point is, before giving the gun out, they'd have known that these are problematical people, and they wouldn't have given the gun out.
And the heart of that analysis is that just common sense kind of questioning. Just going and say, if you look at every one of these stories that you just said, after the fact, there was always that story, they just weren't a little bit right. There was always that edge of the story. They just did not play with the full deck. Some form or fashion of that emerges in almost every one of those stories. And the wisdom of what you're talking about is based on the idea that the observation day to day is going to tell you a lot more than what they have to do when they go and fill out a gun check. Isn't that kind of the heart of it?
Sure. You're absolutely right. And the argument that the NRA offers to oppose having a real background check system such as they have in England, by doing appropriate probing such as they do in England, it might take a month or two to go through everything that you had to go through to confirm that you're going to let somebody have an instrument that can kill people, that's designed for killing.
Elliot Fineman, thank you for joining me. The work that you do is so important, and it allows us to at least look critically and intelligently about this huge problem that seems to be getting worse, not better. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Republicans have found a new rallying cry for their base. It's getting their followers to be angry about the fact that Obama is an imperial president, that Obama has become a king-like president. In the same breath they say that, though, they're saying time and time again how he is ineffective, how he won't lead. Well, they can't have it both ways. I've got Howard Nations here to talk about that very issue. Howard, the New York Times did a great article where they talked about this contradiction that we're seeing coming from the right. It is on one breath, they're saying this is an imperial presidency. He's proclaimed himself the king. And then in the next breath, they say he barely is able to govern this nation. Constantly, those two themes are what we're hearing. Now, the interesting thing to me is that the followers, the teabagger Republican followers, are so, I guess, so dull-brained that they don't even see there's a contradiction here. It's amazing to me.
Yeah, on one hand, they're saying Obama is weak and ineffective, especially in foreign policy, and he leads from behind. They tried to reach Osama bin Laden for a comment on that, but as usual, the Republicans couldn't find him. But they also say Obama is conducting imperial presidency, overstepping his constitutional authority and choosing which laws to follow. But you got to understand that the target demographic of these conflicting messages is the Republican base, which is unencumbered by reason or logic. So it shouldn't be a problem for them to sell this message.
Well, it is. But Howard, at some times, don't you just step back and you say, look, have we become so dumbed down that even the people delivering the message are shameless about the idea? You know, as I say, they're concerned about executive orders. They say this is a president who is ignoring the American public, going forward with executive orders. He has signed a fraction of the executive orders that Bush signed or that Bush's daddy signed. I mean, so first of all, we know that's a lie, but it doesn't keep them from making that argument because they know that the American public has become so damn dumbed down that they can sell that. They're comfortable with it, aren't they?
Well, just remember that the people that they're appealing to think that Sarah Palin and Michelle Bachmann are good presidential candidates and real material for the presidency. So let's look at Paul Bruen to see what's happening on the stump. This is the guy who's running for the Senate in Georgia. He says that Obama has veered totally out of control, and what he uses as examples of that are the IRS abusing conservative groups. He says of Shakespearean proportions. If it's Shakespearean, it must be much ado about nothing. That was such a non-issue. But now let's look at this. He's still attacking Obama on Obamacare, the ACA being imperialism. It was passed by the House, it was passed by the Senate, it was signed by the President, it was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, it was upheld again by the public, who reelected Obama. You compare the Republican actions on Obamacare, they refused to accept the constitutional law of the land. They voted to repeal it 40 times. It's a complete waste of legislative time because if they do pass or repeal, Obama would veto it. But it remains a centerpiece of the Republican campaigns and the centerpiece of Ryan's new budget.
Town hall meetings, it's in the budget, it's that same drone. And here's what's really ugly. The people watching this that, call themselves GOP teabaggers, they won't admit that really the only people who really buy into this is the insurance industry that's pumping all the money into making this happen. And never even with that, for example, the ACA, even with the money being pumped in, 7+ million people have signed up. Actually, the numbers are going to be higher. I think they're going to be closer to 8 or 9 million. We have 8 or 9 million people that didn't have insurance that have it. We have people walking out of insurance offices clapping their hands because they're paying $25 a month for insurance and they can actually get coverage. But the point is, rather than being able to deal with the logic of that, you see, the Republicans have hired very good people that always outmaneuver Democrats where it comes on the message. And the message is, this is an imperial president. He thinks he's king. He's pushing his power around. And when you compare what he has done in this administration to what Bush did, there's no comparison. It's not even a close call here.
Well, this is a Frank Luntz term, imperial presidency. He does focus groups. He comes up with things that sell to this demographic. This imperial presidency works in at least 3 ways. It gets voter turnout of the conservative base. It's how the Tea Party won in 2010, and it leads to extreme fundraising among the conservatives. And Obama prodded them directly in his State of the Union message when he said, Republicans are walking contradictions. That he has little choice but to use executive power in this polarized climate. And his spokesman said, we want to work with Congress. If not, we'll do it ourselves. But we see no political downside to this. So,
you or I would say to the president, do it yourself. But truthfully, let's look at it from our angle. From our angle, where we're being honest about this president hasn't done enough. He hasn't used the power of the pen enough. He has not used I'm fine with imperial power if it improves this country right now.
Exactly.
But the truth is, he hasn't done that enough. He's timid. He's a compromiser. He's always trying to reach across the aisle rather than understanding that we're dealing with thugs. On the other side of the aisle are thugs. And I wonder, as I watch this unfold, Howard, whether it has something to do with the idea that they know that about this president. They know that he is so timid. He is so afraid to make a move that by doing this deal with, you're the imperial president, you're proclaiming yourself king, whether or not he takes that together with the fact that he's an African-American and he says, well, maybe you're right, maybe you ought to back off, and so we'll have 2 more years of this president basically doing nothing. Is that something that concerns you?
Well, it is something that concerns me. And the other thing that concerns me is Congress has been setting him up. The Republicans have been setting him up. And it's not just the right wing, the far right wing. The leader, Eric Cantor, issued a 33-page report on the imperial presidency. In March, the House Republicans devoted a week of useless legislation to introducing bills to curb Obama's imperial presidency. What they're doing, it's a complete waste of legislative time, but it's a good political move. What they're doing is setting him up so that they can say, okay, we tried to pass all these things to curb all this, and he just keeps rolling right along with his imperial presidency. Now, will this change things in the red states? Will it make the red states get redder? That doesn't matter. What matters is these same tactics worked in 2010 to launch the Tea Party. So is this imperial presidency going to resonate with the independents? Unlikely. Will it resonate with progressives? No. But it will resonate in the Republican-based town hall meetings, definitely. And it
turns the nuts out. For example, when they have a town hall meeting in my town, if you go there, if you can even get close, you feel like you are in an insane asylum. I mean, that is what happens in these town hall meetings. This is merely something to introduce into the insane asylum, have them ranting and raving and raising hell about things that they don't even understand. So this is that talking point that is that red meat talking point that lets the folks in the institution get really rattled. That's what you're saying here, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is what bothers me about it. It can lead to greater conservative voter turnout, greater base fundraising, and in midterm elections, this could swing the control of the United States Senate to the Republicans. It's worked before. It could work again as the Republicans continue to repeat this phrase and other phrases in their town hall meetings and on that echo chamber known as Fox News.
As we already see right now, when the election was lost down in Tampa, Florida, by a very weak Democrat. As a matter of fact, I know this woman very well. She was a horribly weak Democratic candidate. She lost for governor the last cycle, and they ran her down in Tampa. Well, all of a sudden, you have Democrats that are saying, oh, my gosh, we can't talk about Obamacare because this candidate lost because of Obamacare. No, she lost because she was a bad candidate. But so Democrats, again, are going to be quiet. They're not going to be pushing back. They're not going to be loud, and they're going to get trounced again in midterm elections. This is why Nate Silver says the Democrats are going to lose in the midterms.
Right. President Clinton is urging Democrats to go out and embrace Obamacare, run on Obamacare, brag about, and bring something refreshing to the public on Obamacare, which is the facts and the truth. If the truth and the facts are known about the Affordable Care Act, it would be a wonderful platform for Democrats to run on, but they're timid themselves and they won't do it.
They're so timid. And you know what? The truth is, they're going into these elections, Howard, if you really try to figure out what the message is, I have a hard time doing that. I have a very difficult time trying to figure out what in the hell the message is for the Democrats, because it's almost as if they move into this mode where they disappear. Their message disappears. All they want to do is they become so timid that they don't push back at all. And I think that's what Clinton was trying to tell them. I think they needed to be a lot more aggressive on issues besides just ACA. But Howard Nations, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure, Mike. Thanks.
The United Nations has released a new IPCC report, and it tells us that human beings are responsible for climate change, and climate change is so far down the road that it might be tough to reverse. This is not a drill anymore. This is 2,000 scientists from 140 different nations reviewing 9,000 peer-reviewed articles, and it all is telling us we better get busy saving ourselves. I have with me Michael Klare to talk about that. He's the author of the book, The Race for What's Left. Michael, the IPCC report, I think one of the most important things about it is that people don't understand how credible it is, what an important, huge result this was. Why don't you lay that out for us a little bit?
I think what's so important about this report is it tells us that climate change is not about the weather, it's not about the temperature, it's not about polar bears, it's about impacts on human life, on the life that we all live as humans on this planet, on our food supply, on the water supply, on the cities that we inhabit. These are now under assault. Our lifestyle is at risk, it's in danger, and further we go into the future, the more this assault is going to intensify.
Michael, let me ask you something. We've been hearing this since before the Al Gore started talking about it. before we heard the inconvenient truth, before we started hearing. But now we have a report. Talk about how this report was put together. Why this is kind of the icing on the cake that tells us this is a report we damn sure better pay attention to. Tell us what went into this.
What went into this is thousands of scientific studies about the impacts of climate change on ecosystems that humans depend on for their survival around the world. That is, water supplies, rivers, the level of water in rivers around the world, disappearing glaciers that feed into the rivers that provide the irrigation water for food systems in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. It talks about growing inundation of coastal communities around the world. So it provides a lot of scientific information, very specifically of measurable effects of communities that are at risk. But it focused very especially on food production.
Okay, and let me stop you right there. There wasn't just one scientist. This is 2,000 scientists worked on this report. 2,000 different scientists from 110 different nations. And you talked about the peer-reviewed report. They reviewed 9,000 peer-reviewed studies. And what does a peer-reviewed study mean? Just so the listeners understand, that's not something that some cat with Fox News writes. That is peer-reviewed. What does that mean?
That means that a scientific report, before it is published, before it's put into print, it's circulated among other highly respected scientists in the field, so that if your results, you could publish some results and say, okay, here's my data, and it shows this, that, and the other thing. But before that's published, it's submitted to other scientists who work in the field, and they review the data, and they have to say, yes, this data is reliable, it's credible. And if they find faults with it, it's not published.
No question, this report is completely above reproach, even from the talking wingbat nuts out there that we see coming from Fox News. That they have to admit, yeah, there's no flaws in the quality of this report. Now, they say that unless we can maintain, unless we can have a world where we don't emit more than 1,000 gigatons of total carbon, that we're toast. It's over.
It's over in the large scale. But what the report shows is that some people are going to be hit harder than others, and it raises a moral dilemma that I think hasn't been properly appreciated before. It shows that people in Africa in particular and South Asia, the poorest communities, the most vulnerable, are going to be hit hardest.
But that's only first. Let me just point out, as I read this, that's just the beginning. It's like it's not just about the polar bear anymore. It's about us, and it's not just about other countries. It's about our coastline disappearing and being hammered with tornadoes and hurricanes and earthquakes and every other damn thing that can go wrong. I mean, so I want to point out, this report is very specific. This is about you and me right now, isn't it?
Well, that's the way I started out. I said everybody is under assault. But there is an ethical dimension to this, that the effects will begin among the most vulnerable first, and then it'll spread to everybody else. And we saw that with Hurricane Sandy in New York City, that it was the vulnerable beach communities in New Jersey and Long Island that suffered the most, and those people are still suffering and are still not getting the assistance that they need. While wealthier communities have had better recuperation, the poor communities have not. And that's what this report brings out, that there is this ethical dimension to it.
Well, we understand things that we hear. The media, of course, is virtually brain dead on explaining this to anybody. The media's coverage of this report was abysmal. People, I mean, not only did they not cover it, if they did cover it, it's almost as if the reporters did not understand how severe of a message this is. But you'll hear in the terms, as you read the report, you'll understand when they talk about polar vortices. Talk about what did that mean when we heard that this summer, and how does it tie into what this report is saying?
Okay, well, you have to be clear with your listeners that I'm not a meteorologist. Hard word for me to pronounce. I apologize. I'm a political scientist and I look at the human effects of this. But what I understand is they're saying that the polar regions are heating up so rapidly, faster than anywhere else, that it's disturbing the jet stream. And the jet stream that usually stays further north, and because of the heating of the polar regions, the Arctic is moving south, and it's pushing colder air into our part of the world, that is into the temperate zones, and that's why we had such a cold winter.
And you can look at this report and understand this. It's right there in the report on why this happens. The warming of the ocean. There's a connection there. This report talks about the warming of the ocean. Most people don't understand what a huge impact that has on our entire ecosystem. But this report talks about it, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. This is among the many ways in which our lives will be affected. Warming the oceans, first of all, when you warm something up, it expands, and the ocean is expanding, so it's going to reach deeper into our coastlines. But the ocean is also absorbing carbon dioxide. It's acidifying the ocean, and that's killing off coral reefs. It's killing off microorganisms. That moves up the food chain. It's going to kill off fish, and fish is an important part of the global food system.
And this is already happening. This report says we're already way down the road with this, and it's almost like we are the frogs in the boiling pot of water. We don't understand the damn water's boiling all around us. We don't get that. Okay, well, let me talk about your specialty a little more. Politics. What does this do to international unrest? And aren't we already seeing the effects of this international unrest?
Exactly. And as you say, this is what worries me the most, that we're going to feel the effects of climate change, not through the temperature in the air, but through the conflict and the disorder that it's going to produce. For example, as coastal areas are inundated, for example, in Bangladesh, in Vietnam and Africa, and in our own country, millions, hundreds of millions of people are going to be driven from their homes as a result of higher sea levels. Where are those people going to go? They're in the hundreds of millions. They're going to be forced to move inland. And we just have to assume that in many parts of the world, they're not going to be welcome.
Europe is already experiencing it. The Mideast is already experiencing it. We're starting to even experience it here in the United States.
Exactly.
I guess to me, Michael, what people, if somebody hearing about the IPCC believes that this is not the icing on the cake to what everybody has been talking about now for 25 years. They simply haven't taken the time to read this report that is backed up by 2,000 scientists, 9,000 peer-reviewed articles, and 110 nations participated in this. Michael, thank you for joining me.
Always a pleasure.
America's criminal justice system is flawed in almost every regard. A wealthy white man can get away with raping his 3-year-old daughter, and the judge says, well, you don't have to go to prison because you have a lot of money. You are part of the DuPont family. Therefore, you don't have to go to prison. But minorities are often incarcerated on evidence that's inaccurate, things like fingerprint evidence, eyewitness accounts. Every week we're seeing somebody released from prison after spending 20 or 30 years for wrongful convictions. I have Mark Godsey with me, director of the Ohio Innocence Project, to talk about these very issues. Mark, having been a prosecutor before I went into to handle the kind of cases I handle now, products liability cases, I used to rely on eyewitness reports and eyewitness testimony, and I think everybody in the prosecution business does that because they develop a relationship with the police officers. They develop a relationship with the enforcement folks, and they want to believe what they're hearing. Mm-hmm. Thank goodness you are out there. Thank goodness the work that you've done and your organization has done is shining a light on how wrong we have been for so many years in criminal justice. Put it in perspective of how wrong we've been in relying on eyewitness testimony and forensic testimony in general.
Yeah, well, I mean, as long as there have been prisons, there have been people in prison writing to judges and saying, I'm wrongfully convicted, I'm innocent, let me go. And for decades, we just saw this arrogance from the criminal justice system. Judges would respond to those and say, we have the best criminal justice system in the world, we never get it wrong. Along came DNA testing in the early 1990s. It's just proven that our arrogance was misplaced, that we actually make mistakes far more often than we would have realized, and that 75% of the time, when somebody was wrongfully convicted and goes to prison for something they didn't do, it's because of eyewitness identification. And, shockingly, some of these cases where the individuals are proven innocent, at the trial, they had 10 or 11 people get on the stand and say, that's the guy that I saw commit the crime, and I'm 100% positive. I mean, so it's just it's shocking, really.
Well, let me add another side to it. Having worked through the process, being a prosecutor, you're in an office where you have a lot of cases coming at you.
Yeah.
The idea is to move through the cases, move through your docket, obviously work out plea deals or work out convictions. Which cases are you going to try? A lot of that is driven, unfortunately, by the law enforcement agency. The law enforcement goes in, they meet with the prosecutor, they sell the prosecutor on, you really have to bear down on this. And before you know it, the prosecutor is buying into what they have to say until they start asking the tough questions.
Yeah.
In your story that you did, give us the example of 10 eyewitnesses that convicted a person. Tell us that story.
Yeah, well, if you look at the cases, and they're all on the National Registry of Exonerations, which is a website run by the Stanford and Michigan law schools, and you can look at all of these cases, and they're all amazing. One of my personal cases that I worked on, 4 different individuals got on the stand and testified, Raymond Taller as the perpetrator. 2 of them were adults who got a clear look at the guy's face as he was abducting these 2 children, 10 and 13 years old. And then the 2 children got up and testified that this was the guy who did it, and DNA testing proved him completely innocent. So, you were mentioning as the prosecutor's office, you have pressures. It's sort of an assembly line, and I think that's part of it. It becomes just an assembly line type process. The prosecutors become institutionalized. Everybody, the defendants become numbers to them. They become sort of inhumane as they're just moving people through. But we've got to learn to stop and ask tough questions. To be more concerned with justice and focusing on individual cases rather than just the process and the assembly.
Here's the unfortunate thing about it. If you look at the process, and you're very aware of this, the person who can do the most is the prosecutor for justice.
Right.
The prosecutor has the ability to say, you know what, your case is nonsense. I don't believe your witnesses. I don't believe you. I think this is trumped up. I had a friend, for example, in New York, some trumped up, horrible prosecutor that was simply trying to make her name by prosecuting my friend who has a very, very big national profile. So they go after her and they make a case into that was a nothing case into something. And what they ended up doing in that case, and you talk about this here in your article, is they actually manipulate the forensics. And talk about how it's not just an eyewitness issue. It's also, we're sold on CSI, the forensic folks, they're always right. That's nonsense. They're right less than 50% of the time.
Yeah, I'm actually writing a book right now called CSI the Myth. It's amazing how, the public, I guess because of these CSI shows, if a prosecutor puts a white coat lab person on the stand and says, I looked at the tire track in the mud of the crime scene and I've conclusively matched it to the defendant's tire tread on his car, juries just typically accept that as conclusive proof. But another major cause of wrongful conviction we've discovered is faulty forensic sciences. And another thing we've learned about it, that is there's what's called confirmation bias, that, prosecutors and police officers go to these forensic scientists and they say, here's the tire tread of the guy we think did it. He's already confessed to the crime, or 3 witnesses said he did it. And so they're starting off with a bias that this is going to be a match. They've done studies where they go to these forensic scientists and they tell them the opposite. They say, this is a guy that we didn't think do it. We want you to exclude the same tire tread. And they come back with the opposite answer, what they testified in court 6 months earlier. And so one of the things we have to do is realize as human beings, we're incredibly biased. We see things according to sort of the what we expect the answer to be. And in order to make these sciences more reliable, we've got to do them blindly, where the scientists don't know what the supposed right answer is before they start. And we've just got to make it much more scientific and neutral.
But we do know this. I mean, your project, your Innocence Project, has shown that even a forensic pathologist that's there to talk about something as basic as fingerprints.
Yeah.
That they say that they get fingerprint testimony wrong, and they say, yeah, this is absolutely the fingerprint.
That's right.
And then we find out after DNA test, a person spends 20 years in prison, and no, it wasn't even the same DNA, much less the same fingerprint.
It's amazing. And again, just like the studies I was talking about before, there's a guy, a scholar named Dror, D-R-O-R, in Ireland. He's doing these studies where he's going to fingerprint experts and he's saying, hey, this is a fingerprint where the guy was proven innocent by DNA. Can you tell us where this fingerprint expert went wrong? And he's asking this to a fingerprint expert. What the expert doesn't know is what he's showing him is fingerprints that this same expert identified in court as a match 6 months earlier. But fingerprint experts don't realize, they don't remember a fingerprint they looked at 6 months before because they look at fingerprints all day long. And when he goes to him and says, this is one where a fingerprint expert screwed up, got the wrong answer, the fingerprint expert looks at it and says, oh, you're right, this guy made a mistake. This isn't a match. And then it's like, surprise, you testified in court 6 months ago that this was a match. So it just shows how sort of subjective and arbitrary this is.
Your project is just outstanding. It's just, all the way back to Scheck, of course, being involved with this. But the numbers are something like, I think the numbers like 25% of the people that are convicted are wrongful convictions that have already been shown to be wrongful convictions by use of DNA. Did I get that right, or is that about the number?
Well, of the people who are writing to innocence projects and are lucky enough to have DNA in their case, because most of the time the DNA has been destroyed or lost by the police, or it's just the type of case where there wasn't DNA in the first place. But when a case actually goes to testing, in my experience, anecdotally, about 25% of the time it ends up proving the guy innocent.
And so every week we see, every month, it's almost getting to be every week, but certainly we used to be every month, we would see somebody who had spent 20 or 30 years behind bars, and the DNA clearly showed it was not that person. And people don't even realize, this is where it really gets ugly, Mark, that person is very limited on what they can even get back from the state. They've lost their lives. I mean, their lives have been taken from them, and they have no way, certainly, to recoup the years, but they don't even get compensated for that most of the time, do they?
Yeah, it's very difficult to get compensated because in these budgetary times, the states are doing everything they can to save taxpayers' money. So they often fight these cases. And, we've freed 17 people in my Innocence Project in Ohio on grounds of innocence. And 3 of them so far have been compensated. There's several more that will eventually get compensated. Their cases are pending. But many of them probably won't end up getting compensated because it's that difficult.
It really comes down to, this sounds harsh, but after looking at the system for so long, it is one of these issues. Oops. The judge is an idiot, the prosecutor's an idiot, and the law enforcement simply it just wants to move it through, and everybody becomes part of this, including the media part of the time. It's very interesting the way that the media promotes these wrongful convictions so many times, don't they?
Yeah, they get on the bandwagon when a crime happens, and the community's hysterical about it, and all of a sudden the police get a suspect and he becomes the number one demon, number one public enemy, and the media fuels it. Everybody's sure about it. I mean, these wrongful convictions that have been proven innocent. You go back 20 or 30 years ago when they were convicted, and this was, all over the headlines. This was the biggest demon in society. Everybody was confident this guy was guilty. And the media did do a lot to flame that at the time instead of stopping and looking carefully.
So let's add idiot reporters to the story, okay? Mark, thank you for what you do, okay? All of America should be very grateful for what your project does. The Innocence Project has done so much for democracy in this country. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on and sharing the message.
Okay. Politicians in Washington are turning a blind eye towards the looting of your pension programs. It's giving Wall Street a new pass, and it is a pass to steal the very money that you think you're saving. Matthew Edling's here to talk about that. It's a pretty sobering story. Matthew, we saw Wall Street, first of all, the big attack on Social Security has been without end ever since they thought they could move money from Social Security protected programs into their pocket. Wall Street's simply trying to push that money over to them so they can lose it, just like we did, I guess, in the last big crash. But they're also having great success with looting pension programs. And the way they're doing it, obviously, is with the help of politics. Explain how that's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a lot of things in life, Pap. The truth gets clouded, and it's just a question of who can sell it better. So what you have now is where defined pension plans had been the norm in this country since really the Great Depression, and had led to the growth of our middle class. You saw in the last administration, beginning with the Bush administration and then carried through into sort of a Republican uptick in both your state and federal offices, an effort to take money from what were defined pension plans and put them into private 401k plans, which would benefit Wall Street, which in turn, given that our elected officials are constantly running for office and needing to raise money, a relative pool by which they could quickly, efficiently get money, run for election, and you have, unfortunately, what we see all across this country, which is the interconnectedness and marriage between Wall Street and politics in Washington, which has become really an unfortunate reality for middle America.
Matthew, one thing we saw Alan Greenspan, who, of course, came out time and time again in worship of Wall Street, and that is, if we give our money to Wall Street, everything is going to be okay. If we deregulate Wall Street, everything's going to be okay. We've seen this and we've heard it so many times. If we go back, we have an advantage here. That's to go back and look at the 401k that was just actually forced on us. And this is being sold as something that was really going to protect us. If you take a look at the typical 401k now and compare it to the way people used to build their pension programs, there's no question that it really didn't work in the way that we were told it was going to.
That's absolutely correct.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, what I was going to say is, when you actually look at the facts, which is what we should do, right? We shouldn't get caught up in who's selling what and what their goal is, but in actuality, what has happened to retirees. According to the National Institute on Retirement Security, pension plans deliver the same results, if not better, than 401ks, and they do it at a cost that is 46% lower. Now that's a fact, as opposed to what we've been seeing coming out of Washington and Wall Street. And when you think about this, we say, okay, we're going to trust our money to the same private equity, VC, and Wall Street firms that took us into the last recession. For what? For, if we actually were to apply the facts, less return, because what they're doing is, instead of putting in our retirees into safe and secure investments that will allow people to retire gracefully, they hedge. They go into alternative investments.
Okay, let me back up. Let me back up on something you said, because I think it's a brilliant observation that most people don't understand. Along comes the 401k, and we're told, look, this is really, I mean, it was before your time. I remember it, and it was that this is revolutionary. This is going to allow you to make so much money at the cost of the government, and Wall Street's going to be really good to you. And then they found out that what Wall Street was doing is churning the 401k every way they could. The cost of just having a 401k started rising incredibly. And then every time government came in and said, well, what's happening here? Why is this costing so much? They steal an average of $155,000 for a medium income from a family during the time that this 401k is developed. $155,000. Did I say me? I meant $155,000. So, and that is the cost of giving a broker the free rein to do whatever the hell they want to do in a 401k. And that's the way this was sold to the American public. Now we have, as you were starting to talk about, we're now saying, well, let's trust Wall Street even more. And we're seeing that with the pensions, with people like Governor Christie. We're seeing it in Rhode Island. We're seeing the use of this new scam in a different light. Explain what's happening there.
Yeah, so what you touched on it exactly, which is the 401k came about in the early 80s. This is a pretty new vehicle. And what we saw, it starts with the Reagan administration, gains steam in Bush 2. And then what we have now are elected officials. Let's use Governor Christie as a prime example. He comes in his first campaign, he says, we need to get rid of Corzine. He's too connected to Wall Street. What's the first thing that he does? The first thing that he does is he heads down to Wall Street to raise a bunch of money and says, we have this enormous unfunded pension liability. Is that true? Of course it's not. What is an unfunded pension liability? It's just like a mortgage, right? You have your principal and you're paying it off on a monthly basis. What's the key difference between a mortgage and an unfunded pension liability? Unfunded pension, you have the benefit of investment growth. Market goes up, those unfunded pension liabilities go down. All this is, in its most simple sense, is a snow job by Christie and others because they are, for lack of a better word, in the pocket of Wall Street and private equity because they got to keep running for office, and for Christie, he's got to figure out how to cover up his political corruption so he can still run for president.
Okay, that's well put. Well, what I saw with this is the Christie example you used, I think is right on point. We saw this was all about money. As you pointed out, he ran against Corzine, saying Corzine is all tied into Wall Street. They want to give Wall Street your money. He beat Corzine on that, with that angle. Then we come out and we find out that a guy named Paul Singer, who is really the finance man behind Christie, has given this governor, I think, it's $1.2 million that he put in just in the Republican governors group that Christie heads up. $1.2 million as a payback. There's no other way to put it. It was clearly a payback. And so we see this happening state by state, especially where we have Republicans, don't we?
That's correct. And, Singer's not alone, right? I mean, we got Dan Loeb, who's one of the most well-known hedge fund activist, destructive investors that we have in the country. Same thing with Governor Christie. We've seen it in Wisconsin. We've seen it in Rhode Island. We've seen it in virtually every state where you have a Republican governor. And it's become basically just the beat of a drum. You can almost guarantee that it's going to happen. And unfortunately for the regular consumer who has to trust or should trust what their elected officials say, as you've already touched upon, all this is basically a guarantee that you're going to lose money in terms of fees and commissions on what should be your protected retirement.
It is a money bonanza for Wall Street, and your broker that you're giving your money to, he's very happy anytime you can deregulate this process and put it in Wall Street's hands. Matthew, thank you for joining me.
You bet. Have a good one.
That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.